creating loops or rolling to either side. Now you know exactly what all your threads are doing. First, check the straight stitches. If you see the seam is puckering, loosen the needle tensions one number at a time until the puckering stops. Open the seam, and if you see ladders, tighten the tensions accordingly. Most serger needle tensions are preset at the same number or one number apart for the best tension. Next, look at the overcast stitches. If there are loops of thread off the edge, tighten the tension to bring the loops closer to the edge. If the overcast stitches are rolling to one side, loosen the tension on the side the stitch is rolling to. If you are adjusting the tensions and nothing is making a good stitch, remember the troubleshooting tip about making sure all the threads are seated in the tension discs properly. I'll run through some different fabric weights and types to help you visualize this. I'll start with a basic medium weight cotton, such as a quilting cotton. First, look at the stitch on the upper side. Is it puckered? Open the fabric. Are there ladders? Check the upper and lower side of the fabric for loops of stitches on the edge or stitches rolling to one side. Next up is a lightweight or silky type of fabric. This fabric typically puckers at a cotton setting and will, most likely, need to have a looser tension on the needles. They also often have loops on the edge which need to be tightened. Next is a knit. Since they tend to be a little thicker or spongier, lift the toe of the presser foot and place the fabric under the foot. The foot on all sergers is hinged. This helps keep the fabric from shifting at the beginning of the stitch. If it looks as if the fabric is cut or has runs, this is a good time to switch to a stretch needle. Lastly, let's look at heavy fabric such as denim or upholstery. Many times it is difficult to get the needle threads to lock in enough on this type of fabric to have a really strong seam. If you tighten the needles a lot and still see the ladder, you'll want to use a sewing machine to sew the straight stitch and the serger to finish the edge. If you are fortunate enough to own a baby lock serger with automatic tensions, your machine measures the weight of the thread and the thickness of the fabric to give you a perfectly balanced stitch. Now that you're more familiar with the serger parts, threading, and tensions, it's time to learn some practical skills. There are basic things that are second nature on the sewing machine, but need a new set of skills on the serger. The feed dogs on the serger are very long and let you manipulate your fabric easier than your sewing machine. This is very useful if you are sewing a long seam, such as on a pair of pants or a curtain panel. You've experienced sewing or serging a long seam, and when you get to the end of the seams don't match up. Do you usually just trim off the excess? Assuming you cut everything out properly, the seams should match at the end. Here's a way to make them match, and it's also very useful for easing in a flat sleeve cap or a shoulder seam. Pin at the beginning and end of the seam. As you get to the bottom of the seam, hold the top fabric taut. The bottom fabric will ease right in. Unfortunately, a serger doesn't have a back stitch like a sewing machine, so you need to find a way to secure the seam at the beginning or end. If one seam is crossing over another, there is no need to secure. But if you want to secure a seam, there is an easier way than tying a knot or threading the tail back through the seam with the needle. First, you need to become familiar with a part of the needle plate called the stitch fingers. They're located under the presser foot, so they are hard to see. Take the foot off and look at where the stitches form the loops. When you pull on the stitches, you'll see one or more stitch fingers that the stitches form over. To secure stitches at the beginning of a seam, stitch 1 or 2 stitches into the fabric. This can be difficult to see since there is so much going on with the machine, such as the foot, doors, etc. If you sit up to the machine and look down at the needles as if you were looking through a microscope, you should be able to see exactly where the needles are in relation to the fabric. Raise the foot, grab the thread loop just in back of the presser foot and pull on it. I call this making it skinny. This will release the loop off the stitch finger. Pull the thread tail to the left and under the foot to the right, snugging it up against the needles. Now place the thread loop on top of the foot so that it falls in between the needles and blade. Lower the presser foot and serge over the thread tail, encasing it into the stitch. When you have stitched over the tail about an inch or so, move the tail in front of the blade to cut it off and continue on with the seam. To secure stitches at the end of a seam, stitch 1 or 2 stitches off the end of the fabric. Raise the foot and gently nudge the stitches off the stitch finger. Flip the fabric over on its back and place the fabric under the foot so the needles are at the very edge of the fabric. Lower the foot and serge, keeping the blade as close to the original stitching without cutting as possible. Don't worry, this gets easier with practice. If you nudge too much, you'll end up with a loop at the end of your fabric. Too little and you won't be able to turn the fabric over. Most people simply angle off the edge of the fabric, but the messy threads at the end drive me crazy. Here's a way to exit the fabric and still keep a neat appearance. Raise the foot, turn the fabric to the back, lower the foot, and serge. That's much nicer. Stitching an inside curve on a serger can be tricky because you can't pivot around the curves like you can on a sewing machine. Oftentimes, when trying to serge an inside curve, such as a crotch seam, the stitches come off or barely catch the curved portion. When you try to fix it, it just gets worse and worse. The trick is very simple. Fabric cut on a curve is actually on the bias, and the bias stretches. Simply straighten the curve as you're serging, and you'll always have a good seam. It may look a little wavy when you're done, but a little steaming will flatten it. It is difficult to maintain an even seam allowance around an outside curve because the long presser foot holds the back of the fabric so that it's difficult to manipulate around the back of the curve. Stop every couple of stitches, raise the foot, and pull the fabric from in back of the foot. Steam the stitches to help them look smooth. Inside corners are much like an inside curve. It needs to be straightened. Cut a 1/4 inch clip at a 45-degree angle into the corner and straighten the fabric as you serge, just skimming the edge of the fabric. Don't worry about the fold at the left of the angled clip. It will work its way right into the stitch. You will need to cut off any seam allowance first and just skim the edge of the fabric. For an outside corner, stitch 1 or 2 stitches past the corner edge. Raise the foot and nudge the stitches off the stitch finger. Turn the fabric, place under the foot, and right up to the needles. With the foot still raised, pull up the slack on the threads above the tensions. This pulls up any excess threads that the nudging produced. Lower the foot and continue serging. It's important to know that even though you have done all of these steps, that not all your corners will turn out loop-free. Murphy's Law, you know. If you do get a loop, just secure the corner with a few stitches on your sewing machine. T-shirt necklines often have a rib knit binding. Traditional ribbing is hard to find these days, but you can use the fabric instead. Cut the binding shorter than the neckline circumference to hug into the body, usually about 3/4 of the neckline amount. Sew the binding into a circle, mark the neckline and binding into quarters, match up the quarter marks, and stretch the binding to fit the new neckline while serging. At the beginning, the seam is thick, so lift up the front of the foot to get the fabric underneath. Take a couple of stitches into the fabric and stretch the binding to fit the neckline. This is an inside curve, so straighten the curve as you serge. When you are done, you will have a beautiful and stretchy neckline. If you do any pressing, be sure not to press into the binding, just press the seam allowance. Before cover stitch was the industry standard for hemming knits, many hems were sewn with a technique called a sport hem. Fold the garment or curtain hem to 1/2 inch more than the desired width and pin along the bottom of the hem. Then fold the garment back on itself, leaving a 1/4 inch lip of the hem exposed. Place the fold under the foot so the blade cuts off the extra 1/4 inch lip and serge. When you unfold the fabric, you'll have a nice looking hem or casing. Adding a buttonhole or two before serging gives you access for draw cords. Ready to wear rarely uses a casing for the elastic. As we all know, even non-roll elastic will roll in a casing. In order to get the look of ready to wear where the elastic is stitched in, you first need the correct kind of elastic. An elastic that won't break down with the puncture of the needle or stretch out of shape is difficult to find in the fabric chain stores. This would be a garment industry elastic or fantastic elastic from Pamela's Patterns. For most applications, the elastic is cut 2 to 3 inches smaller than the waist measurement, sewn into a circle, and marked into quarters. Then the garment is marked into quarters, and the elastic is placed on the wrong side of the garment, matching the quarter points. Stretch the elastic to fit the fabric and serge at the top of the elastic. Finishing would be done on a sewing machine, straight stitching down to the wrong side of the garment just inside the serged edge, and steam to shrink the elastic back in shape. You'll never thread elastic through a casing again. Sergers were the first home machines to offer differential feed. It's a fairly sophisticated bit of timing the feed dogs to produce different results for stitching. Here's how and why it works, and what it can do for you. If you look at the feeding system under the presser foot, you see that the feed dogs are split between the front and back sections. The machine has a control knob or lever that enables you to adjust the differential feed. The default setting is usually normal or 1. When you increase the setting to a higher number, it speeds up the front set of feed dogs. And when you decrease to a lower number, it slows down the front set of feed dogs. These features help with controlling tricky fabrics such as knits, creates beautiful gathering, and lettuce leaf edging. It either adds a slight stretching or a slight gathering. Gathering fabric is one of my favorite things to do with the serger. Tighten your needle tensions. Set the differential feed at the highest number and set the longest stitch length. The weight of your fabric determines how much the serger will gather. A lightweight fabric gathers at least a 2-to-1 ratio, whereas a heavy fabric won't gather as much. If you need to gather the fabric more, pull the thread tail, and when you see the 2 short threads pop out, they're the needle threads. Pull against them for more gathers. To attach a gathered fabric to a flat fabric, place the gathered fabric on top of the flat, 1/4 inch from the edge, with the right sides together. Place the blade as close as possible to the gathered edge and serge through both layers. Did you know there's an accessory foot that will do these 2 steps in one? It gathers the top fabric while you're sewing it to the flat fabric. Knits stretch considerably when stitching, whether using a sewing machine or a serger. For this reason, people are often apprehensive to work with them. By setting your differential feed to a higher number, It feeds the knit fabric into the back feed dogs faster, keeping the knit from stretching out of shape. Every knit fabric requires its own amount of differential feed, and you need to stitch a sample to see what works best. Lettuce leaf edging is a pretty edge found on children's clothing, evening wear, and sportswear. Set the differential feed to the lowest number and your rolled hem to a short stitch length. Because the front feed dogs are set to a slow speed, it stretches the fabric into a nice wave. After doing the edging, pull on the edge of the fabric to create even more defined waves. Oftentimes we think of a serger as a utility machine used for cutting edges and sewing fast finished seams, but they have their decorative talents too. I'd like to show you a few of my favorites. A flat lock is the most versatile decorative stitch of all. It's like getting two stitches in one. One side is a beautiful loop stitch and the other side is a ladder stitch. It's created by either using a left needle for a wide flat lock or the right needle for a narrow flat lock. All the tension must be released from the needle, but the upper looper stays at an average tension, and the lower looper tension gets tightened to about 7. It's very easy to tell if you have a good flat lock before you ever open the fabric. The upper side of the fabric should look like a normal overcast stitch, and the underside of the fabric should look like perfect V's or W's. When the stitch looks like this, it will open easily and lay almost flat. Although its name, flat lock, would indicate a completely flat stitch, it has a fold inside the stitch. The flat lock stitch looks like a loop on one side and a ladder on the other. Which side you use is a personal design choice. Using the left needle gives a wider flat lock, and using the right needle gives a delicate narrow version. The flat lock stitch is actually strong enough to create a decorative seam. If you want the loops to show, stitch with the wrong sides together. And if you want the ladders to show, stitch with the right sides together. To highlight a decorative thread for the loop stitching, put it in the upper looper. To highlight the ladder stitch, use a top stitch needle and decorative thread through the needle. A flat lock stitch can look as if it's stitched down the middle of the fabric, when actually the fabric is folded. The stitch is sewn on the folded edge and then opened. The flat lock stitch is often used for lingerie. Because it opens flat, there's no bulk for a seam. For that reason, it's perfect on the edge of slips and to attach lace. Create a flat lock hem that looks similar to vintage hem stitching. It's created by folding the fabric as if you were sewing a blind hem on a sewing machine. Now I'll show you how to set the serger for both rolled and narrow hems and tell you what they're best suited for. For rolled hemming, the serger's needle plate needs to be modified. In the past, this was done by changing the whole needle plate, but most sergers today have a way of reconfiguring the needle plate by pulling one of the stitch fingers away with a simple setting. The stitch length is usually set shorter for this technique, and the needle thread and upper looper tensions stay at about normal. The difference between a rolled and narrow hem is that the rolled hem actually rolls the fabric into the stitch, creating a small ridge at the edge. This is achieved by tightening the lower looper tension. It's most often used for napkins or home dec projects and is a very sturdy edge. A narrow hem is a balanced stitch so that the lower looper is set on an average tension. Making corners with a narrow or rolled hem is a breeze. Simply serge off the end so there's a thread tail at the corners. Use a seam sealant such as Fray Check to secure all the corners, and when dry, clip the threads. Heirloom type stitches are beautifully sewn with a rolled hem. Create pin tucks by folding the fabric and stitching along the edge. Laces are easily joined together by placing the needle inside the header of the lace. Let the serger sew in air to create the chain for button loops. Stitching a rolled hem on a silk fabric often produces